Like I said, they're starting to see divisions and falling support for the lockdown measures in some of these markets. So the first question I'd like to ask each of you to answer, and perhaps Tiago, you could start us off, is how much public support is there in Brazil for government policies? And yours is probably the most colorful country to talk about. And what kind is that support waning? And I realize it's a complex question in Brazil, but I'll leave that to you to answer.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk with all of you. The situation in Brazil is very complex because, after all, we are a federative republic. So power is shared in a way that it's different from other Latin American countries. The major decision-making relies with the governors and their ability to impose or restrict or take away lockdowns and quarantines. At the end of the day, the president, he becomes mostly a major opinion maker in relation to the enforcement of quarantines and the behavior of individuals of whether respecting that or not. Basically, this is what's creating mass confusion, because if you put an extra layer of political disputes between the president and specific governors, you have governors right now imposing quarantines or imposing certain restrictions, while at the same time the president defends otherwise. This creates mass confusion, but we are still in the phase that the majority of the support is for quarantines. However, people are becoming tired of that, particularly because the parcel of the population who are respecting the quarantines are blaming the individuals who are not for the extensive period of quarantines in Brazil. So a badly done or badly enforced quarantine and zero is the same thing. And this is part of the debate that we're having right now.
Bolsonaro has been under tremendous pressure. There has been, my understanding is, several different initiatives sent to Congress to have him impeached. They have not been acted upon thus far, but certainly I imagine the broad congressional support that he had for, particularly for Paulo Guedes' reform agenda, must have been impacted by this crisis. Can you talk to us a little bit about what kind of political support, beyond the public opinion, what sort of political support Bolsonaro has through his sort of coalition of like-minded parties in government, and what is this going to do to his ability to legislate things like the tax reform and other reforms that the business community has been waiting for in Brazil for an awfully long time?
Well, throughout 2019, we had basically a parallel government inside the Brazilian government, which was the kingdom of the Ministry of Economy. And why do I refer to it as a kingdom? Because at that particular situation, in the construction of this new administration, the Ministry of Finance combined with the Ministry of Trade, the Ministry of Budget, and also placed under the umbrella of Minister Guedes, the direct control over several other economic areas of the government, even the state-owned banks, the central bank president responds informally, but in a continuous base to Guedes. So the creation of this kingdom allowed them to also develop a strategy of direct approach to the parliament, which didn't require the usual stop that traditional governments had done through the presidential palace. So what we've seen in 2019 is that the coalition was much more solid towards the measures that came from the Ministry of Economy, rather from the measures that came from the presidential palace. So that created a dysfunction that, depending on the angle that you look at, the government was very efficient, but depending on a different angle, mainly on the political questions, the government was not efficient. So this led Bolsonaro to do what he does best, which is create a confrontational narrative in order to put popular pressure upon certain individuals, expecting that this could rearrange the configuration of power for him. The target at that time was the Speaker of the House, Rodrigo Maia, and through a series of expositions, President Bolsonaro blamed the Speaker of the House for specific losses that they had in the parliament. This created popular pressure against the Brazilian Congress, and this led to a disarrangement and a disorganization of an already disorganized allied base. And why disorganized? Because instead of creating an allied base, trying to bring in parties together, Bolsonaro, he attempted to do something different by creating an allied base, a base that fluctuated depending on the topics. At the end of the day, this worked, but the fluctuation increased in number in economic issues and decreased in number in other political issues. So the levels of defeat that Bolsonaro faced in Congress were mainly imposed by betrayals in his own allied base. Understanding this, Bolsonaro decided to make a move towards the centrist parties, which were demonized by him during the electoral campaign, when he blamed the centrist parties, which are very pragmatic and follow no direct or clear ideological path, for the historical evils of Brazilian politics. However, this group of individuals, they bring in a substantial number of congressmen that could basically shift the stability and the solidity of this allied base inside the Congress. So the move from Bolsonaro was to create this belt of support inside the Congress, adding an extra layer of solidity through bringing in the centrist parties to the government. But there was a cost for that. There is a cost for that. And the cost is that the leaderships in the centrist parties, they want to be part of the decision-making process at the executive. So the cost will be the appointment of specific individuals from the centrist parties in key positions inside the executive. Naturally, this creates a backlash in public opinion, but on the other way, it brings the expected solidity that President Bolsonaro wants. However, this solidity, although loyal in the beginning, demands a constant construction that Bolsonaro, throughout his career, has proven that he has no experience in. During 30 years in Congress, Bolsonaro was never the leader of a party, the president of a committee, the rapporteur of a bill, or the leader of a caucus. So he was never in a position of working with convergence. Divergence was always his political strength. So right now, what we see is that by bringing in the centrist parties, Bolsonaro hardly will face an impeachment. All he needs is 172 votes to block any impeachment request inside the House of Representatives. With the composition of his old allied base, plus the centrist parties, he has well over 220 votes, members of the parliament, creating a structure that would protect him from an impeachment. However, this can shift and change depending on the volume of pressure that comes from the streets, because the composition for an impeachment is public pressure to a certain point that breaks out your allied base inside the Congress, plus a very clear and understood motive from the Brazilian society in order to wrap this up. You will never see an impeachment process with a sound and good economic environment. But when we are facing the risk of an 8% fall in the GDP for this year, this will create an economic environment that could fuel in for public pressure in the streets and put more risk in the stability of the allied base, since Bolsonaro has no experience in maintaining this kind of convergence.
Okay, quick follow-up. If there's an ascendancy of those pragmatic centrist parties, where does Guedes' reform agenda stand in this environment? Can he legislate in this environment, or is everything sort of put on hold until next year? When will there be concrete movement on a couple of the very important pending reforms that certainly I can think of at least $60 billion of hedge fund money is sitting, waiting, to see what happens around those reforms?
Exactly. Well, under this new alliance, naturally, he is currently smiling, and I spoke with members of his team last night. that he's confident that with this solid alliance, as long as Bolsonaro is fulfilling the promise of delivering certain positions in the government to these centrist leaderships, they will deliver back the votes. However, the problem in 2020 is the calendar. You have the coronavirus, you have the municipal elections that could be delayed, but no more than 2 months. And around December, we will see the movements for the election of the new Speaker of the House and the new President of the Senate, which, in the case of the Speaker of the House, will probably be one from the centrist parties. So the composition of votes is looking favorable for the approval of a tax reform, for example. However, the timing is not. When we look historically, the first and the third year of a Brazilian administration are usually the best years for the approval of structural measures. So 2021 can be the best year for that, as long as the political environment delivers some sort of stability. And this is precisely the problem that the market looks in Brazil, which is the instability generated by the political environment. So we were able to create two major political crises encapsulated inside one of the major global crises of our generation. So this ability of generating crisis is what creates uncertainty in the market, in the investors, and in the ability of the government to deliver. Just a quick point, the risk of the centrist parties towards Guedes is the interference, and part of the negotiation between the centrist parties and Bolsonaro lead to a point that Bolsonaro appoints leaderships of the centrist parties inside Guedes' kingdom. This is a risk, because if this happens, and it's natural for the centrist leaderships to want to occupy positions with high budget, this could generate a sort of interference that was similar to what Moro claimed that Bolsonaro was doing when he was interfering in Moro's previous kingdom.
Got it. Excellent. Thank you. So my question to each of you could start with you, Tiago. You advise a lot of companies on the investment climate in Brazil, and I realize it's going to vary industry by industry. But generally speaking, is Brazil going to be an easier place to do? Now let's put the pandemic beside. Let's say 18 months from now, there's a vaccine, the health scare has been strongly reduced. Is Brazil going to be an easier place to do business, a less costly place to do business, or is it going to be a more costly place to do business than it is before the pandemic? Tiago, I think you've successfully reconnected. Please, I'd love to hear your thoughts on future business environment in Brazil.
Well, yes, good to be back. I see that, as I was explaining, historically, we had two types of investors in Brazil. One focused more on speculative capital. It was one that was looking more at short terms. And the interest rates in Brazil was always very attractive for this type of investor. So in 2015, we had 14% interest rate versus the 3% that we have today. However, when we look today, the productive capital, or the more longer term capital, they look at Brazil with more interest for two reasons. First, the long-term interest rate still looks something positive for them. It still looks as an opportunity. And at the same time, the exchange rate makes Brazil very cheap. However, the questions that I listen more from my clients are related to two issues. First, the methodology of the central bank in order to control the exchange rate, in order to avoid it spiraling out of control. How effective is that? The answer right now is that it is relatively efficient, because as I was talking this week with the president of the Brazilian Central Bank, the expectation is that they will do whatever is necessary, mostly through swaps, to avoid the currency to go over 6 or 620 or something like that. At the same time, there is a major pressure from the agricultural sector, and we don't need to remind everyone of how important commodities are for Brazil, for the exchange rate not to drop very much. So it is a number that maintaining relatively high is good for Brazilian exports and also at the same time, it makes cheap for long-term investments in Brazil. However, the number one doubt is about the government, because the government is a prolific producer of uncertainties. And as what I listen mostly from my clients is that they don't care at the end of the day if the government will generate good or bad news. Because good news, they will take advantage of it, and bad news, they will protect themselves from it. The uncertainty is what kills the possibility of investment, because uncertainty prevents them from understanding what will happen in the short term. And this right now is the biggest concern for the investor. In terms of the reforms, the expectation for the approval of structural reforms next year is relatively good, but it depends once again on the political stability and the capacity of the government to sustain the alliance that I mentioned before with the centrist parties. At the same time, we're going to see a government that probably will have more willingness to spend money rather than the austerity behavior that we saw from Paulo Guedes in this first year of administration. So the subsidized credit from state-owned banks could be a reality. We could see again BNDES playing a potential role in stimulating companies in order to grow and recover. Fiscal incentives is also a possibility that the ministerial economic team are working with it. And of course, access to credit. Brazil has immense foreign reserves, over $400 billion. Right now, the idea is not to use those reserves because of confidence issue. However, they are there, and they still give discussion of confidence for the investor when it comes to Brazil, because they see no risk of of an economic meltdown. So today, the number one question in terms of confidence in investing in Brazil still comes from political stability.
Quick follow-up, Tiago. One of the questions from our attendees, the replacement of the Minister of Justice. Who is the new minister? What is that minister's position in terms of the Lava Jato investigation? What does will this minister maintain those investigations? Will Bolsonaro be able to continue to interfere as he was accused of by Moro? And what does this mean for the business community in Brazil and its ability to operate?
Well, first of all, and this is something that not very lots of people are fully aware. The investigations of the car wash or anything like that are not conducted by the Ministry of Justice. In fact, the Ministry of Justice have no access to that whatsoever. It's the judicial system in Brazil. We can question its quality, but we cannot question its independence. So the car wash operation is conducted by independent investigations, which are focused mainly in the state of Paraná, in the city of Curitiba. However, the car wash operation is an operation that relied heavily on plea bargains in a very similar technique that we saw on Operation Clean Hands in Italy. In fact, Moro is one of the biggest Brazilian specialists in the Operation Clean Hands from Italy, where he emulated several of the behaviors and actions that he saw there. So the plea bargain sequence in Brazil comes to a point for the Operation Car Wash that starts coming back on itself, to a point that no new fact emerges from that. So I don't see that the Operation Car Wash can reveal anything much bigger than what it already revealed, because the collection of proofs and evidence comes from the plea bargains, and it basically fulfilled several circles of one individual pointing out to another, or a company pointing out to another, that it won't leave this circuit that we already saw. The Ministry of Justice, basically, they have the administrative leadership over the federal police, which is the Brazilian equivalent from the FBI. However, they cannot interfere on the actions of the federal police. So a group of individuals inside the federal police, they have the autonomy to investigate an investigation as they want at any time against anyone. And the Minister of Justice, he has to be informed, but he cannot intervene, block, interrupt, or even change the individuals who are currently at the core. He can change naturally the director of the federal police, but the Brazilian federal police, I would say that is probably one of the most respected organs in the Brazilian administration. Just for an example, for you to become a federal policeman in Brazil, you must have a law degree. So the levels of policemen that occupies this force are very, very high. So André Mendonça, the new Minister of Justice, he is an individual that is very aligned with Bolsonaro. He will look, for example, the National Security Force that can use operations by request of governors to intervene on very heavy secure operations and security issues in particular places. However, he cannot decide the fate of certain investigations because this is not the competence of the Ministry of Justice. If we make an exercise of possibilities, in theory, the worst case thing, the scenario, or the worst action that the Ministry of Justice could do is basically leak information to the president. And this naturally is a risk. This naturally is one of the questionings that several individuals made when he appointed someone so close to him. But this is something that it's still in the realm of absolute speculation because we have seen no evidence or anything in this sense. So shifting the control of the Ministry of Justice is something more symbolic and internal to the government than actual changes in public policies.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Close to 200 people listening. There's been some fabulous questions that have been posted. I don't believe we'll be able to address them all, but let me ask each of our panel to answer this question. You all deal with different sectors and investors looking, and there are certainly some opportunistic investors who've been through the ups and downs of Latin America in the past and tend to find opportunity in these times of crisis. Without naming names of clients, tell us which industries are you receiving interest from? And then I'll finish with what we're seeing at our firm. But I'd love to hear from each of you, and maybe it will be a reflection of where there's opportunities for investment right now in your countries. Tiago, do you want to start us off?
Absolutely. The telecom sector is one that has been very intense in talking with me. We're going to have, in the beginning of next year, the largest 5G bidding process in the world. And this also brings a major geopolitical element to it because Huawei will participate in the competition alongside Nokia from Finland and Ericsson from Sweden. So this will be something big, and this is already attracting the attention of several companies in the entire chain, telecom chain, because of the investments being made. Also, infrastructure is a major thing. And the sewage system, there is this project which will go forward probably this year about the privatization of the sewage system in Brazil. And this is a major issue of attractiveness for investors because we still have 40% to reach in terms of fulfilling a universal sewage system. So once we fulfill that, it's a service that the companies will make money in a never-ending way because people will not stop to use it or cease to use it. So it is seen as a major opportunity. And also when they look at the bargains, several companies that are sound economic, that they have a cash flow, that they have the projective demand from their customers. But right now, because of the coronavirus, they're suffering with it. And also, given the exchange rates, they're becoming cheaper. So there are several funds looking and asking for lists of companies per sector in which they can buy a stake of it. And I think probably in about 3-4 months, Brazil will be a very large shopping mall to the most aggressive investor, and depending on politics, to the most cautious investor as well.
Great, thank you. I know at AMI, we've received a lot of interest around e-commerce. We've done a couple of webinars on it. We've put together a report that is being widely purchased that forecast e-commerce numbers. 3 of our practices intersect around e-commerce: our payments practice, our logistics practice, and our consumer services practice. And for payments companies, it's very interesting because people are eschewing cash and want to buy digitally. It's safer to do so. And of course, there's something like 20 million new e-commerce customers in Latin America, according to a Visa report out yesterday. And that's just Visa. So Visa's got probably 60% market share. So let's call it 30 million new e-commerce customers across Latin America that have come on board through COVID. Another area I would agree with you, Sergio, is mining, particularly gold mining. The price of gold is back near record high, and energy tends to be about 30% of their cost, operational costs. So you're going to see gold mining companies looking very favorable as vehicles to receive investment monies, and that's going to help expand their expansion into the region. Colombia, of course, is an important gold deposit area, as well as more traditional ones like Peru and Brazil, but also Ecuador, the DR, et cetera. In fact, I would say it's gold and Barrick's project in the DR that's keeping that government afloat, because tourism has collapsed. Healthcare, of course, a lot of interest, tends to be opportunistic around the sale of specific equipment, specific devices. Another really interesting area, again, echoing what Tiago and Sergio said, is infrastructure. The big players, the people who can think long-term, the pension funds, the large operators who have strong balance sheets right now, they like to invest in infrastructure in downtimes when currencies are weak, because most of these projects rely on local currency revenue intake. And so investing when currencies are weak, when governments are anxious to attract investors, is the optimal time. And if you're taking a 20-year investment position in an infrastructure play, the timing of your entry has a massive impact on the return on investment. And so the big global players are definitely interested in infrastructure right now. Logistics, last mile, again, related to e-commerce, is huge. And I would echo what Roberto said on online education. Most universities in Latin America on the private side have dabbled with online education, usually in some sort of association or collaboration with an international university. But now they have to really push forward and perhaps offer all of their classes online, or a much more of a hybrid. And then what has not really moved forward at all in Latin America is K-12 public education. And that suddenly needs to be, in parts of the region, will need to go online. And that's a real challenge that different players are scrambling to provide. I want to take this opportunity to thank all 3 of our panelists, as well as Abel, who helps put these webinars together and keep them flowing. I want to thank our audience. A couple of people in the audience said, why aren't we dealing with other countries in Latin America? Well, as you can see by just the robustness of the responses provided by 3 panelists, we barely scratched the surface in Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia. There's 21 countries in Latin America. It's just, it's a matter of time management. At some point, we may need to do country by country webinars to really dig deep. But thank you to everyone who tuned in for your excellent questions. And we look forward to your replies. We've put up everyone's email here on this last page. Feel free to reach out to us. and ask those questions, and we'll be happy to follow up with all of you. Thank you again for your time today, and look forward to hearing from you in future.